Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you then I'd appreciate it if you left this video a like and subscribe to my channel to see future content like that. And today I'm going to be doing another episode of quick movie reviews. I know I've said that my individual reviews will be more frequent in content for my channel this year, and that is still going to continue to be the case, but I am still going to be doing quick review segments every once in a while. But nevertheless, there are 7 really interesting movies to talk about on the docket here, so let's go ahead and get started with the first movie I will be discussing. And first, we have the newest Scream movie, Scream 6. A lot of people dub Scream as one of their favorite slasher genre franchise films, and I would consider myself within that camp. I would say it is probably my favorite. And there are many out there who would say that Scream is the last remaining franchise where they don't really have a terrible movie to their name. I would add myself to that mix as well. I have enjoyed every Scream movie I've seen to a degree. I will say that I have not seen Scream 3 or 4, which is something I'm planning on getting on, and I really should because I love all the other Scream movies to varying degrees. I was hoping that Scream 6 might do things a little bit differently, might change things up, because Scream 5, I will say, did have some predictability to it. It was more like a classic Scream movie, definitely more like Scream 1 or Scream 2, which means that you are getting some things to expect out of it. So I was hoping for a little bit of a change with Scream 6. And I will say in some ways we did get that, while in other ways we didn't. Now, overall, I would say once again that I did really enjoy this movie. I think it is generally a crowd pleaser, and based on the Rotten Tomatoes scores, at least for audiences, they were very pleased with what they got here, and I can understand why. I think Ghostface is a far more brutal killer here. I think that he does a lot more intense kills and is maybe a little bit more active and doesn't seem maybe as clumsy or as darkly comedic as he did in the earlier Scream movies in some ways. So people are going to like that, and I personally did like that. I did like seeing the more brutal kills here, and even him getting to wield a gun at one point. That was pretty cool. Also, I will say that probably the best thing this movie did was take place in a new location. We are now in New York, and I think that the movie took advantage of being in that place. I think it did a good job of taking advantage of various settings, especially a train setting, which already is something that is very intense to happen in New York because there's all sorts of unpredictable people that can be compacted in such a tight space. But added on to the fact that it was taking place during Halloween in this movie, and that Ghostface was on the hunt for the main characters, and the tension really increased in that train scene, and it works really well. I think it's probably the best part of the movie. I will say that even though we do have the legacy characters back in this one, I appreciate that they focus a little more on the new cast here, and they give them a little bit more to do. I especially like that they gave Jenna Ortega a bigger role in this movie. I really liked her in the Scream 5, and I think she was probably the best part of that movie, and of course, ever since then, she has definitely blown up as an actress, so that is probably another reason they gave her a bigger role to play in this one, was because of how big she got. But nevertheless, I am glad that they gave her a bigger role. I think she is the most compelling character here, probably, and I would even say that Melissa Barrera is better here as Sam Carpenter, the main character. I didn't really care for her in Scream 5. Her story was not super compelling, and I will say they sort of repeat her character arc too, of her being the daughter of a serial killer, aka the original Ghostface in the first movie, but I think they nail the character arc here a little better, and plus, I think they leave it off in a pretty good place to where we hopefully won't have to necessarily repeat that again. I think Jasmine Savoy Brown and Mason Gooding were both good here, and I liked them far better in this one than I did in the original. Or I should say Scream 5. I just keep on saying original because Scream 5 was sort of a reboot in some ways. But I think they both had much more compelling character arcs here too, especially Jasmine Savoy Brown playing the sort of character who's doing the meta commentary on movies and horror tropes as a whole. Hayden Panettiere is back as Kirby Reed, who was in Scream 4, and like I said, while I've not seen that movie, I'm sure a lot of fans of that one will be very pleased with that one, and I've heard a lot of people say that Scream 4 is one of the best Scream movies, so a lot of people will be happy to see what she's doing here and the role she plays, and Courtney Cox, as always, is good fun as Gale Weathers. Now, let's get into some of the critiques I have about this movie. Probably the first would be that for as much as I do like Ghostface being a more brutal killer here, I think it makes for some more cartoony kills. Some people will like that, and some people will think that it is more brutally realistic, but I did sort of like the realism that Ghostface had in the original Scream movies, where they were a little clumsy, and that was meant to be darkly comedic, but it was also meant to make sort of Ghostface a little more terrifying in my mind, because you knew behind that mask was just a regular person doing all these sadistic things. The ghost face here is, of course, all too human still, but it seems like the ghost face in this one is able to carry out maybe some more inhuman or superpowered acts than I would expect. So the realism is a little lost here, in my opinion, compared to at least the Wes Craven Scream movies, but it's not something that necessarily bothered me too much considering the tone of this movie. It's just something I noticed. What did bother me is that with the increased brutality and kills, the kills don't seem to have much impact here. In fact, some characters who should die in this movie just don't. And there are several times when characters, in my opinion, should have been severely injured, or definitely there should have been one character at least that died in this movie from what they sustained. But I get that they're trying to poke fun at that stuff, but I do also think they go a little bit too far. I also do think there's some parts in this movie where it can falter a little bit in the plot. I think, even though I did say that I liked Sam's character arc better here, I think they maybe take too long to explore it in some parts, and also there's these budding relationships that are building up in the movie, and I just don't really find that part of the film to be super interesting. Still, overall, I did enjoy this new Scream movie. I don't think I'd consider it one of the top tier ones, but I still think it's a good movie, and I think it still continues Scream's surprisingly solid streak of having great films 6 movies in. It's sort of wild how they're still able to accomplish that. But kudos to them, and I'll be open to seeing more of these as long as we continue getting more good ones like this. So, solid 3.5 out of 5 stars for this film. Next, let's talk about Knock at the Cabin, which is the newest film from M. Night Shyamalan. I told you that we'd be going a little bit all over the place because this movie released pretty early in the year, but nevertheless, I did want to talk about this movie. And I think it's pretty solid, although it once again is a more mediocre film from Shyamalan to me, sort of like Old was. But I do think I like it a little better than Old, because I do think it has a more compelling story. For one, it is taking place in one location, and I do tend to like movies that do this. If the movie takes advantage of the isolated location that it is in, that makes it even better, and I think this movie does. I think the isolated location plays into the mystery factor of these characters who are saying that the end of the world is coming. Are they just delusional, or is this actually happening? For a big portion of the movie, that mystery plays out, and the only evidence we see is of news clips that could potentially be altered by the people who are showing the news clips to this family, and that's all we have of the outside world for a good long time. I think pretty much all the performances are generally solid here. I think Dave Bautista is great here as Leonard. I have such great respect for this guy for doing so many different types of roles, and I appreciate that he is the type that wants to try and expand his craft more and more. Also, Jonathan Groff and Ben Aldridge are both great as a couple here, Eric and Andrew. I thought they both brought something super interesting to the table, particularly Jonathan Groff with a performance that seems to be the one that is more timid at first, but as his character evolves, you start seeing some really interesting layers to him. Kristen Cooey, sorry if I mispronounced that, as Wynn, the daughter, is also also really good. I think this is probably her first role, or among her first, as a child actress, but I think she does good here. She definitely is embodying the M. Night Shyamalan mannerisms of how he portrays children, with a sort of monotone delivery in some places, but she also does let the emotion come through in a lot of places too, and I like that M. Night Shyamalan lets that happen. As far as critiques go, I would say that the movie does play it fairly safe. For a movie that is rated R, it shies away from the violence shockingly often. And this is not something that I usually complain about. I actually like when a movie plays it more subtle, but this movie almost does it too much. And we don't really get to see the full extent of the horrors that these people experience. I've heard that the book has a different ending than the movie, and I do hope that the book's ending is a little better because the movie's was pretty underwhelming to me and didn't really follow where I thought the movie was going to go. It felt a little out of left field in my opinion. Still, overall, I did generally enjoy this movie. It was a pretty straightforward horror movie, but I think it was a solid one, and I think it's a good time. 3 out of 5 stars for this one. Next, I'm going to talk about the movie Missing, which is another January movie. So yeah, we're talking about some early movies here, like I said, but I did want to talk about this movie very briefly. I don't have a whole crazy lot to say about this movie. You can call it the spiritual successor to Missing, because it is playing in that same field, and I think it is even taking place in the same world as Missing. Overall, I do think this is actually a really solid sequel to Searching. I may not like it better than Searching, but I do think this one plays with the formula a little bit and maybe has even a little bit more fun with it. And I think some people are going to probably prefer that, especially the Gen Z audience that this movie seems to be aimed at. If Searching was more aimed at older adults or older Gen X or even millennials, then this movie is definitely more aimed towards the Gen Z audience, especially with this teenage main character. But I don't think that's a bad thing at all, especially because it is emphasizing so much on technology. I like that it still keeps consistently to the rule that technology is always the medium at which characters are talking through. And it makes even more sense here because our world is so technologically integrated that this is a possibility. And I like all the ways they bend and play with that rule and have the characters communicate through different technology, and they also use like security cameras, TV footage, news footage, all that good stuff, and I think it adds up to creating a movie with a lot of variety and a lot of interesting visual tricks. Performances here are pretty solid as well. I think Storm Reid is really good as June. Her performance can falter a couple times, but I do think overall she was a good main character, and I liked the arc that she went through. She was a flawed character in many ways, especially with how she treated her mother, but you understood what she was going through, especially with her struggles with losing her dad and all the secrets that her mother seemed to be keeping from her. My favorite performance in this movie probably goes to Joaquin de Almeida as Javi, who is a character that Storm Reid is talking with a foreigner who is trying to help her figure out what happened to her mom on the vacation they went on. His character is a lot of fun, and I like how his struggles with his son sort of relate to Storm Reid's own struggles with her mom, and they sort of form a connection and relate to each other because of that. I do think this movie has a lot of interesting twists and turns too. It keeps on keeping you guessing. Just when you think you've got what is going on down, then it shifts things, and it keeps on making you ask questions like, is the mom sincere? Is Kevin really as bad as he seems? Is the mom's lawyer really honest, or is she hiding something as well? Probably the biggest criticism is that some of the things you think about with the plan that the antagonist this movie has carry out, I'm not going to spoil it obviously, because I think this is a movie you need to experience it for yourself, but the plan when you do think about it after the movie over is a little preposterous, and there are some things that it seems like there would just need to be a pitch perfect precision for it to work out the way that the antagonists were wanting it to work out. So for some people that is going to bother them, but for me, I just didn't really mind that much because I was enjoying the ride. But nevertheless, it does leave some plot holes when you think about it for too long, but not ones that leave me with a bad taste in my mouth. I did really like this movie, and I thought it worked very well. 3.5 out of 5 stars. Very strong movie, and surprisingly strong for a January release especially. Now next, let's talk about an Apple TV Plus original. Apple TV has been coming out with quite a bit of movies lately, and they're actually doing a pretty good job at being in competition with some well-established streaming platforms, especially with Sharper, which has a pretty stacked cast, including the likes of Julianne Moore, Sebastian Stan, and John Lithgow, among others. I think this movie is generally solid, I will say. It is sort of a neo-noir. It's playing with the idea of characters deceiving other characters and a mystery with lots of twists. So this movie is about characters conning each other, essentially. That is really the best summary you could give it. And it starts off with Tom, who is the sort of main character, I guess you could say, getting conned by Sandra, who pretends to be in love with him, but is really after him for his father's money for different reasons. But this movie keeps on making you ask questions of how these characters got to this point. How did Sandra get to a point where she was conning Tom? And you see that she met someone else who was a con artist and she learned from him. But how did this guy end up conning? His name is Max, played by Sebastian Stan. And we learn more about his story and his relationship with Julianne Moore's character, Madeline Phillips. It plays very much so with trying to make you question things, and it does play sort of on a trope like Missing, where it's constantly trying to have twists. But unlike Missing, I do think that the twists don't work quite as well in this movie. At first, they are pretty fun, especially when you're seeing that the movie is sort of playing a con game with you as well. But then it comes to a point where you're expecting to be conned. And I think that's when the movie starts becoming a little predictable, is when you're like, oh, this isn't the thing that is actually happening. They're conning us. This is what's going to actually happen. But it also comes to a point of absurdity, in my opinion. There's this part near the ending third of the movie where something happens, and it is so ridiculous how it is revealed these characters tricked both Madeline and Max, who are the sort of antagonists of the movie, and the way that the main characters trick the antagonists and how it's revealed just seems really silly to me. It didn't make me hate the movie though. I still did consider it decent at the end of the day. I just wish that the movie maybe had done different types of cons instead of the same con over and over. I will also say that it did bring the movie down that Justice Smith, who was playing the main character, was not necessarily a super compelling actor. I have not really cared for this guy as a performer. I never cared for him in Jurassic World Dominion, and I haven't been super compelled by him since then, and it just sounds like he'd want to be anywhere else. Even though there were some ending parts of this movie that bothered me, I still did find it relatively decent at the end of the day, and I would give it a light 3 out of 5 stars. Alright, next I'm going to talk about another January release movie, but one that got a pretty big cult following, especially with the Gen Z audience, which is M3GAN. A movie, of course, about a killer doll in the style of Chucky, except this doll is a girl this time. And yeah, you can definitely tell that this movie is taking influence from Child's Play, but I do think it becomes its own unique entity in a way. And I think the movie has a lot of fun with M3GAN. I think that's this movie's biggest strength, is M3GAN herself. It is something we've seen many times, but I think that the movie plays it a little more cartoonish, helps make it stand out from the pack of all the things that we've seen about crazy killer AIs, and I think it does work for that reason. M3GAN is a fun character, and I think that there is a good emotive story at the center of this with Gemma and Katie's relationship. I think that the two of them work well off each other, especially with Katie's trauma of losing her parents, and Gemma of not really wanting to be a parental figure, but having to take this role very suddenly and not being prepared for it. And so she uses M3GAN as a sort of sub-parental figure. Unfortunately, I think if you've seen the trailer of this movie, you have seen the movie in some ways. I really wish that trailers would stop doing that. I guess another more major complaint about the movie is that it doesn't get as brutal as I would have wanted it to. Sort of similarly to Knock at the Cabin. I think that M3GAN is clearly a brutal killer, and I think there's parts where they really could have gone there a little further. I mean, honestly, her first kill is probably her most intense, and then they don't really raise the bar after that. Now, this is a PG-13 movie, so I understand why they didn't do that. But I would like to see a world where this movie could have been a little more intense. I do think that even though I did say that Katie's story, the main little girl in this movie, her story is very sympathetic. I do think it's a little cliched of like her losing her parents and having to move to this new place and it being very unfamiliar. It is a very familiar horror movie setup, but I guess it's fine for what it is. Overall, this movie is good. I think it works well for what it does. I think people are going to enjoy it, and I think it really works for the audience that it is meant for. So, kudos to M3GAN for just being a generally agreeable horror movie, and it's always nice to see horror movies doing well and succeeding in the box office, especially one that's coming out this early. And I'm looking forward to the sequel of this movie whenever it comes out. Solid 3 out of 5 stars for me. Next, I want to talk about Skinamarink, which was a movie that went very viral on TikTok, at least its trailers did. And it makes sense why this type of movie would go viral on TikTok. It has a very backrooms vibe to it in its trailers where you aren't able to see much and it's just a lot of walls and static and just mysterious figures. I went into it very open-minded, and I'm glad I did because this movie is excellent. Like, this is great and definitely one of my favorite movies of the year so far, if not my absolute favorite right now. Now, I don't know if it's going to be movie of the year, but it is certainly a contender for one of my favorite movies of the year, I will say that. This movie follows a very, what you could call thin plot line of two children who are up in the middle of the night and they realize that their parents have sort of disappeared or they don't know what has happened to them. And apparently something especially is wrong with their mom. Harrowing is the right word to use for this movie, for sure, because this is definitely a pretty raw and terrifying experience in some ways. Now, some people are going to just say that this is a movie about looking at walls for long periods of time or looking at ceilings or a TV screen and not much happening, but I can't agree with that personally. I think this movie is a lot more than that. You're looking at this movie through a child's perspective. It's very first-person point of view. You sort of feel the vulnerability. They're very small. They can't reach certain things. The ceilings look like monoliths to them, as do the walls. Everything seems unreachable to them, like they are struggling to reach light switches, so it makes sense why the house stays dark, because they can't reach all of them because of how small they are. Like, these are young children, probably 4 or 5 years old at most. And the vulnerability comes through as a result of that. It also makes the horror feel sort of upsetting in some ways. I'm not sure if I've been able to call many horror movies genuinely upsetting to me, but it was hard watching what these children went through. This movie seems to me to be a sort of commentary on abuse. A lot of people have theorized it as such, with the parents being, in the children's eyes, controlled by a monster, but really, it's just the abusive side of the parents coming out, and it's a horror that they have to deal with daily. And there are some parts that sent legitimate cold chills of both my and my brother's spines when we watched it. I mean, there's this scene with this telephone, this toy telephone, that legitimately just sent goosebumps up me in a way that felt so raw, and I haven't felt that in a horror movie in a long time, even from my favorite horror movies of last year. Another thing I will say about this movie is that you have to be in the right setting to watch it. I don't usually say that about movies. I generally do like watching movies in the theater, for an example, but I don't necessarily think all movies require a theater experience. Some certainly do. But this is a movie actually where I'd say it doesn't need the movie theater experience, but rather a more intimate setting where you can just be in a room with all the lights off and just the TV on like the kids do. Now, if there were any critiques I had to give this movie, I'd say the main one was, even though I do not think that this movie is just about kids looking at walls and the ceiling, there are a lot of shots in this movie that go on for a little longer than they need to, and I think this movie could have been cut down a little bit as well. But nevertheless, I think Skinamarink is a very unique horror movie, and I really want to see what Kyle Edward Ball does next, because if this is his calling card, this is a pretty impressive one, and I think it shows that he will do some very creative things in the horror landscape. And it's always nice to see unique horror movies like this come out. This is why I will always support indie horror creators, no matter how insane the concept might be. I always like seeing indie horror come out into the world, and seeing it do well like this movie did is only an added bonus. Strong 4 out of 5 stars for this one for me. Finally, I want to talk about Infinity Pool, a movie where I don't have as much to say about it, but nevertheless did have a great time with it. And this is the latest from Brandon Cronenberg, who made the movie Possessor a couple years ago, a movie that I really enjoyed and found to be crazy unique, so I was very excited to see what he would do with this movie, and I was hoping that his distinctly bizarre and electronic visual style would come back, and I was not left disappointed, I would say. This movie weirdly reminds me of if the TV show The White Lotus were a horror movie, because it is about rich people just being horrible and doing horrible things to other people and not caring about the consequences of their actions. But they frame it in a much more horrifying way than The White Lotus does. But it is also a satire, like The White Lotus was. So it was sort of cool to see those comparisons. I think this movie works pretty well. It is maybe a little blunt in its commentary about the rich, maybe even very visually blunt in how the rich just are monsters and make monsters of other people through exerting their influence on them, and they use their wealth in corrupt ways, and they treat people of other cultures with just disrespect. And I think the commentary of the rich corrupting people especially comes through Alexander Skarsgård's character, James Foster, who is a more middle-class person, but he is trying his best to be part of the rich class by marrying rich. And you can tell that he has his insecurities with that. This movie takes a very bizarre twist with that, with the fact that on this island, this vacation resort that the rich are visiting, they can basically commit any crime they want without really fear of consequence, because in this world, if you have enough money, then you can pay for a double to be executed in your place, because this world is very harsh in that it executes people if they commit certain crimes, but the rich can use a double to take the fall for their crimes through a sort of technology that they use. And it is very interesting because it brings up some questions that are asked of, what if you were the person that died? What if it wasn't your double that died, but what if it was actually you that died and your double was the one that lived? I think the commentary of that is purposeful. You're not really ever supposed to know who's the double and who's not. And I like that mystery plays out, and I like that it is never answered. It is something that Possessor did too, and I like the playing with the mystery aspect. Skarsgård is great in this movie, of course, but Mia Goth might be the highlight here as Gabby Bauer. Mia Goth has just been so impressive lately in the films that she's played in, and she is great here too. She plays this role absolutely unhinged, but I will say, like I said originally, the commentary on this movie is maybe a little bit too on the nose, and there are parts of this movie where I think it goes bizarre just for the sake of being bizarre. Like, there's a couple of scenes here that I think are unnecessary, but then those scenes are made up with some visually just incredible scenes. I love what Brandon does with his visuals, with using all this colorful lighting that makes for just super compelling scenes and creates some very cool visual effects that you don't see in many horror movies like this. So I can sort of forgive the sort of maybe overindulgent scenes just for that reason. But nevertheless, I did enjoy this movie. I thought it was pretty solid, and I would recommend it. 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. So yeah, that ends this episode of Quick Movie Reviews. What were your thoughts on any of the movies I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I appreciate it if you left a like on this video and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.